Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Ama Ata Aidoo's play, The Dilemma of a Ghost, which I'm reading out of Modern African Drama. Now, Aidoo is incredibly important in not only Ghanaian theater, but Ghanaian literature in general. And I've actually even seen some people go as far as arguing that she basically built modern Ghanaian theater from the ground up. Like, she is the foundational figure in Ghana's theater scene. And The Dilemma of a Ghost is a really interesting play. It's a post-colonial play, but rather than taking on the post-colonial conflict between Ghana and Britain, its former colonial power, what Dilemma of a Ghost is primarily interested in is the culture clash between Ghanaian culture and African American cultures. So it is worth noting, very specifically, Ghana is a multicultural society. It's not necessarily clear to me what particular culture, what particular ethnicity the Ghanaians in this play are. I don't know that much about Ghana and the different ethnic groups, nationalities, etc., etc. And it's also worth noting that there are a number of different African American cultures. But one thing that's very interesting and striking about African American culture is that there has been a long tradition of a sort of back to Africa movement. People like Marcus Garvey, for instance, were at least for a portion of his career as a public figure, he was very much an advocate that African Americans should go back to Africa and sort of re-assimilate into African cultures. The problem with this, and often I think Marcus Garvey went to Africa and then sort of decided, actually, African cultures are very, very different than the cultures of African Americans. And so maybe this isn't necessarily the best idea, but this idea of sort of back to Africa, back to the homeland, etc., getting out of the white man's nation, etc., has been a very prominent idea in many African American circles, at least since the 1850s. So it has a long track record. And so in this play, you have Otto Yasin, who is a student who has come to the U.S., a graduate student who's come to the U.S. To get his education. He has met and married Eulalie Yasin, whose maiden name was Rush. She's an African-American woman, and she is excited to move back to Ghana with him. And so much of the tension of the play comes from the different cultural frames of reference for the Ghanaian characters, Otto's family, versus the frame of reference that Eulalie has as an African American. Particularly, differences in terms of women's work or women's social position. Because in Ghana, I mean, this play, I forget what year this play premiered. This play premiered in 1965. So in 1965, Ghanaian culture, much of West Africa, was much more of a traditional society, particularly after national independence. Many African cultures attempted to sort of reassert pre-colonial traditions to greater or lesser extents, whereas in the 60s in the US, mid-60s, you didn't, like, the hippie movement was beginning, the civil rights movement was gathering steam, women's rights movement was gathering steam, etc., etc. So you had much more of a liberated mindset or framework. But what we end up getting in this play is a multifaceted conflict between what Eulalie wants and expects versus what Otto's Ghanaian family wants and expects from her. Eulalie, as an African American, is much more individualistic than the very communally oriented Ghanaian family, or the very family-oriented Ghanaian characters. So she often wants to do things just with her and Otto, just with the two of them making their own life choices, etc., etc. The Ghanaian family, by contrast, feels that Otto and Eulalie should be much more engaged in the communal life of the family, and that the family should have much more of an impact on what kinds of lifestyle choices they make. So one big conflict in this case is Eulalie and Otto decide that they want to hold off on having a baby. Very standard thing in the West. Very, very common in America, in Northern Europe, whatever it is. People often decide that they don't yet want to have children. The Ghanaian characters have a very difficult time even conceptualizing this. And actually, especially in the last portion of the play, that becomes a major, major source of tension, because Otto does not really even attempt to make his family understand this situation. And when he does finally attempt to, so initially they assume that Eulalie is barren, and they actually try to do a ritual in which they would wash her stomach in a particular potion in order to drive away evil spirits. Eulalie is not on board with this, very decidedly, and so the family doesn't understand the situation, in part because Otto has not attempted to explain it to them, because he knows that they just won't be able to conceptualize it. And when he later does attempt to explain to his mother, there's this bit where so his mother, so Otto says, if we wanted children, she would have given birth to some. Essie, which is Otto's mother, says, aye, everyone should come and listen to this. I've not heard anything like this before. Human beings deciding when they must have children? Meanwhile, where is God? Yet only a woman who is barren will tell her neighbors such a tale. Otto says, but it can be done. Essie says, if it can be done, do it. But I am sure any woman who does it will die by the anger of the ghosts of her fathers, or at least she will never get the children when she wants them. So, the Ghanaian family members are simply incapable of understanding the perspective that Eulalie takes on this, because they are culturally situated with a different set of expectations. Their presumption is that a marriage is supposed to produce children. That is its primary objective. And so the idea of getting married but then not having children is something they can't really wrap their heads around. And again, Otto really drops the ball here because he doesn't actually attempt to explain it until almost the last moment of the play. And even then, he doesn't do a very good job explaining it. Now, part of the problem with all of this comes from the set of conflicting impressions that each side has of the other. Things that they each believe about the other, that the family in Ghana believes about Eulalie, and that Eulalie believes about the Ghanaians. The Ghanaians, for instance, believe that Eulalie is extremely wasteful and lazy and vain because she uses a refrigerator, she gets new clothes, she gets an oven, things like this. So things that in the US in the 60s would have been very, very common, sort of basic necessities that people would live with. For this rural family, these are extravagances. Like, most of their food is cooked over wood fires, etc., etc. So we get these differing things. Eulalie, for her part, has some very insulting critiques of the Ghanaians. Toward the end of the play, she gets drunk. Otto is trying to get her to come to this Thanksgiving ceremony. It's a memorial service, basically, for a cousin of his who has died. And she refuses. She's gotten drunk. And she says, "Since you can preach so well, can't you preach to your people to try and have just a little bit of understanding for the things they don't know anything about?" Otto says, "Shut up. How much does the American Negro know?" Eulalie says, "Do you compare us with these bastards, these stupid, narrow-minded savages with us? Do you dare?" At which point Otto hits her. There's a continual undercurrent of misogyny from Otto, which is very problematic. It was also the 60s, so it was part of the times, but very much problematic from today's perspective. But this idea of, like, Eulalie as an African American who has the standards of living for the US in the 1960s is seen as wasteful, and the family members at various points in the play argue that Otto is wasting money on her, that he's catering to her every whim, etc., etc. She makes the argument that she has had to, Eulalie makes the argument that she's had to give up a ton of stuff and conform to these cultural standards that she doesn't understand and that nobody has been considerate of her, etc., etc. So you have this conflict over how this cultural interaction has gone. Each side views themselves as the victim and the other side as the person who has gotten their way across the board. Now, the thing that I actually find really, 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 really interesting about Dilemma of a Ghost is the last bit of the play, because Otto gets drunk. He comes to see his mom because Eulalie has left. The whole story of she's not infertile, we just didn't want to have kids yet, comes out. His mom is pissed. And then something interesting happens. Essie, the mom, is sort of saying, She's kind of explaining why the family is upset about this situation and their sort of belief that that Otto and Eulalie trying not to have children is a big problem. And Essie says, and yet who can blame her? No stranger ever breaks the law. My son, you have not dealt with us well, and you have not dealt with your wife well in this. Then a little bit later, she gives this sort of proverb. It says, before the stranger should dip his finger into the thick palm nut soup, it is a townsman must have told him to. And we must be careful with your wife. You tell us her mother is dead. If she had any tenderness, her ghost must be keeping watch over all which happens to her. So, and actually during that sort of lengthy speech, Eulalie arrives and sort of collapses, and Essie runs down to help her. So, at the end of the play, Essie comes to this realization that it's actually not Eulalie's fault. It's not that she knows Ghanaian culture and norms and is just failing to meet them. It is literal. It becomes Otto's fault for failing to sort of culturally sensitize each side, you might say. Like, because he has failed to make clear to Eulalie what the Ghanaians are going to expect, and because he has failed to make clear to the Ghanaians how Eulalie views the world, this has become the source of tension. And so, Otto, who was sort of the golden boy, the scholar who had gone to America and was all like great and successful and stuff, at the end, he becomes the repository of all of the cultural misunderstandings and failures exhibited in the play.